All right, we're recording. Welcome to the, what day is it? The October 25th, 2017 meeting of SIG API Machinery. We have one thing on the agenda last I looked at, which I was in the process of reading right before we started, which is the Open API. We're debating whether to move Open API spec to be more like other Kubernetes API objects. So I don't know, Mehdi's here.
Yes,
you want to summarize?
Yes, so there are two designs there. Well, the one that is recommended in the design. So the thing is, I added this last week before the meeting, and people wanted to read it, so we moved it to this week. The main design is actually saying that /OpenAPI dash the version of /OpenAPI / v2 or v3 would be the endpoint, and then we'll use HTTP headers like accept JSON.
Maybe, can you get closer to the mic?
Oh. Can you guys hear me? Okay, so the main suggestion is to use /OpenAPI /v2 or v3 with some HTTP headers to tell the server what you want. Do you want it in JSON, YAML, or Proto, and which version you want? Do you want it to be JZipped or not? This is the main suggestion. The alternative suggestion is to have the OpenAPI as an API, a Kubernetes API object. Store it in actually store it in etcd. And I have the design details there. I think some people already commented there. The main benefit of the alternative design is, first, the main benefit is we get whatever we get from the API objects. It's like, different we can set different headers for that, or I think we can watch. Watch versioning, the standard access to the API object, we get all of those auths and everything. So using another endpoint, we'll need to set the different type of auths. We need to set up watch and everything else. So that's the benefit of the alternative design. I wanted to discuss that in the meeting to see which one we should go with.
How big are the Open API docs going to be?
How big?
I think in the text format it's 1.5 megabytes. We can always JZip it, that is 100 kilobytes.
Also, it's not going to be stored in etcd, correct?
I think the suggestion is to store it in etcd.
Even if it is there isn't actually a 1 meg limit on etcd.
There's
a 1 meg limit on Raft.
There's at least a 1 meg limit on the update, which we've hit in the past.
So I wanted to ask, we should be careful around some of the things around that, and I know that was already discussed in the doc. The general idea here of watching something that's describing the thing that you're watching, is it because this is a downstream metadata about something that we have an upstream discovery for, that makes that okay? Like we're saying, well, you can discover that Open API exists so that you can then follow the discovery to go get the Open API.
I'm a little unclear on what the proposal is.
How about we start with the simple?
Now that I've heard that the plan is to put it in etcd, which API server is managing the one in etcd? I think this is for the aggregator to manage the one in etcd.
Yeah.
And other APIs, but then how does the aggregator discover the spec of the other API servers?
Watching them.
But if they're not storing their own spec in etcd.
So other API servers should have they have storage, right? They store their things somewhere.
So at the high level, I like the idea of having /OpenAPI /v2. Does that require these etcd changes, or could you actually just move what we currently serve to /OpenAPI /v2?
No, that doesn't need etcd, but that also doesn't have watch, so we need to implement watch for them.
Wait, why is watch a requirement for the OpenAPI spec?
Because of aggregation. The way we are doing it today is pooling, and it's not right. We should do watch.
So our things that are OpenAPI clients that expect to receive the OpenAPI data in a non-Kubernetes format, are they going to not be able to use this?
Right.
No, there's a sub resource that would expose it in the normal manner for clients that don't talk Kubernetes.
You can't do that
I want to push back on the idea that watch is a requirement. Like, I think it's okay if these things take 10 seconds to update. I don't see, I see watch as being useful for the aggregator, but not useful for anybody else. So,
what is that? I missed why it had to be a Kubernetes resource.
Yeah, it's just a suggestion to be a Kubernetes resource.
That's what we're debating.
Discussing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So right now, the design doc has it moving to endpoints that are slightly more principled than the one that we have right now. And I guess the thing under discussion is whether we should just go all the way and make them into full-blown Kubernetes style API endpoints.
So the thing is, I want to be clear. I agree with actually /OpenAPI/v2 myself. I'm just playing the devil's advocate, and I want to make sure that this will not come up again, and in 6 months or a year, I said, oh, it's good to be an API object. So let's discuss it now. Make sure that we don't want to do it, and then do the OpenAPI v2 thing.
So we've talked about OpenAPI is a very broad spec. It covers things like that we want. It covers a number of different things we want: discovery of API endpoints. It has model objects, validation, documentation. Are all of those use cases the same use case? Like when we talk about things like we want to do server-side validation of individual resources, we've talked about things like we want to push validation to the server just because it's too much work for clients to go do their own open API validation. Are we a little too focused on open API as I guess I'm kind of asking, how important is open API? Like, I get the feeling that there's a couple of use cases which maybe I don't see why the urgency of open API as this primal thing that's fundamentally a first-class Kubernetes concept that's exposed. Other than it helps for automation, don't get me wrong. I just don't see it as the Kubernetes falls apart if OpenAPI doesn't get improved or isn't available via these endpoints in a short time frame.
I think that the burning reason for ourselves to have OpenAPI is that we use it to generate the clients, like non-Go language clients.
And kubectl is also using it for
Kube control, yeah. Kube control,
which we do offline, right? We don't do those. We don't go talk to GKE and then generate an API from that, right?
Yes.
Don't, but I think
I'm not saying that this is a Googleism that's leaking out into the world, but I'm kind of saying this is a Googleism. Like, I'm a little worried.
It's not a Googleism.
Yeah.
I mean, I got to be honest. Like, there's a little bit of this, which is like, OpenAPI is great. It's not a magic bullet. I've been around this block a long time, and I've seen many of these systems get really close and then fail and be good for 80% of the things, but not 100%. Are we trying to go for the 100% solution on OpenAPI here? Like if we're going to make a big investment in like structured APIs and all of that, model-driven APIs, great. How much of it do we have to do to deliver value for Kubernetes users? Like, is it 80%, 90%, or 100%? Because I feel like we're going for 100%, but.
Are you involved in community standards while the investment is moderate?
Yeah, I don't feel like there's additional stuff we need to do actually, other than ongoing bug fixes and maintenance.
Well, it's the validation stuff, I think. Like, that's the biggest gap, is we have no, like, we've talked for a long time about validation.
If the main point is client-side stuff, then endpoints and schemas are what clients need, right? Like the validation, we've said for a long time, we don't want that done client-side, we want that done server-side. And so whether that's driven by model stuff in OpenAPI or some other mechanism from a client perspective, that's not really crucial. I see a lot of things kind of calling out OpenAPI like, oh, we can put examples and like templates that you could use to create objects of this kind. We could put that in OpenAPI objects, and that seems like it's creeping past the, like, we want to be able to generate a client that knows what endpoint to talk to and what schema to submit.
Yeah, I mean, if that's your only question, you can use the built-in homegrown discovery API we have, which isn't anything remotely like a standard, but it does answer most of those questions. I think one place that OpenAPI could fit in our server stack is if we want like the aggregator say we want the aggregator to validate, like do a sanity check on an incoming object that it doesn't know anything about.
Yeah.
I mean, CRD is going this way, right? CRD, you can put an OpenAPI spec in, and CRD checks it this way.
CRD
On the back end, yeah.
From an aggregated API server, right? An aggregated API server should be allowed to communicate however it wishes, and should not get intercepted and have someone try to perform validation before.
Yeah, I wasn't claiming that we ought to do that. I'm just saying that's an example of the sort of thing that you could do server side with an OpenAPI spec for an object that you don't understand.
Yeah. And I don't think that works.
Also, the validation, when the clients can do simple validations with OpenAPI spec, not the whole validation.
But we don't want to do that, right? Like, there's two open proposals to stop that.
Yeah, we don't want clients to.
Can I?
Yeah.
Point of order. I feel like we're evaluating the merits of OpenAPI instead of talking.
No, sorry. I was not trying to say that. I'm just saying I feel like this discussion is lacking a scope for OpenAPI. And I have seen a lot of changes in the last 6 months where OpenAPI is being very aggressively pushed. I'm using this as the opportunity to ask, what are we actually trying to solve? Because I can't evaluate this proposal without actually knowing how far we're trying to go down the OpenAPI path.
So I think that's legitimate, to flip this upside down and just say we need use cases at the beginning of this and determine where the priorities are.
No, I think Clayton is debating the meta point. The design proposal is just, we have this thing right now, where should we let clients get it from? Like that's the object level question.
But the next step, I think, could be more fleshed out, which is which clients and what are they trying to do with the information. And so that has an impact on whether Watch is or is not useful or necessary.
Here's a very easy action item. Let's mail someone such as Mehdi emails Kubernetes dev and says, tell us how you use OpenAPI personally. And just so we can, is that useful?
I'm not trying to be obstructionist here. Like, I actually think even just the base proposal of just saying, like, we should have an actual version to OpenAPI endpoint, completely agree with. I would agree to the minimum with no extra discussion. It is the next step that I'm worried about, which is we did an abortive aggregation attempt, an API server. We were a little concerned about that. We've got other things in place like server-side apply, server-side validation, and server-side printing. And that I want to make sure that, like, the scope of OpenAPI is clearly understood and we're all on the same page, because I don't get that feeling.
Yeah, that seems totally reasonable, and I'm kind of in favor of the top part of this design doc rather than the more involved bottom part anyway. So, but we should get on the same, make sure we're all on the same page with what scope we want OpenAPI to have in this project. So that sounds like an action item for Mehdi.
Yeah, sure.
It sounds like another document other than this one. Okay, let's see, somebody chatting. Okay. All right, so to summarize, it seems like I don't hear any objections for moving to the thing in the top part of this design doc, which is OpenAPI, v2, etc. But if someone feels strongly about the alternatives considered section, then we need to make a better case for why users need this level.
I don't think that I want the alternative right now, but that first bit seems fine.
Yeah, that's my impression. That's my impression also. I'm not quite sure what sort of case would persuade me.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, it looks like some people added some more stuff to the agenda. That's great.
just in time.
Let's see. Does somebody want to add the action items that we just discussed into the notes? Somebody needs to. And Cole, do you want to discuss moving CRD validation to beta?
Sure. So I opened an issue for this last week or the week before, and I think mentioned it on Slack or possibly in the meeting even. With feature freeze going in on Friday, I plan to submit PRs for the feature repo and for the feature gating that will go ahead and move CRD validation to beta. I think there's only one comment left on the issue that I opened, and all of the items mentioned in it are things that can be retrofitted back on even after it moves to beta. But I wanted to call it out today in the meeting in case anyone had any lingering thoughts or wanted to go add a comment or be aware of this going in.
I'm definitely not up to speed on CRD. I don't know, David, do you have anything to say about it?
Stefan's on the call. I'll defer to him. I know of maybe one or two bugs, but they didn't seem that serious.
So I commented on the issue. It's basically defaulting and read-only properties, and probably also OpenAPI references if we want that at some point. But all of those things can be added later, so nothing is blocking for beta.
Is the defaulting an issue? Like if you enabled it now and defaulting did not get applied, and we later applied defaulting, so would current specs start getting interpreted differently?
So we assume it's a JSON schema according to OpenAPI, and we refuse those fields, those settings in the spec, which we don't support.
Okay, good.
To avoid exactly that there's surprise when we enable them.
Yep.
So Stefan, somebody suggested something today that was interesting. You guys may want to think about that, is to referring to API, Kubernetes API objects in the CRD validation.
That's what I meant with OpenAPI references. So we could make up a namespace for those references. So you could say my CID can reference a put spec, for example.
Yeah.
We could do that. We made some ideas offline already, but nothing is written down.
So can you CC me on any issue or document or anything related to that?
I'm not even sure it exists.
Okay.
Not much more than a line or two or somewhere.
Okay, there is an issue. I can add you there to add any relevance.
Yeah.
I say, forgive me for not knowing whoever's speaking. If you let me know who it is, I've seen some issues and some discussions of it too. Yeah, I can CC you on them.
This is Mehdi, MBOHLOOL at GitHub.
Okay.
And I was Stefan, STTTS.
Yep. All right. Great. Thanks.
Okay. Matt, this sounds like an interesting topic. Matt Farina, are you on the call?
Hello. So in the SIG apps retrospective, ClientGo, API Machinery, API, and some of those things that sit in the staging directory came up. We were discussing the experience of upgrading from the packages as they were for Kubernetes 1.7 to Kubernetes 1.8 and what that meant in a practical manner. And then throughout the last few weeks, and so I ended up taking an action away to come to SIG API Machinery to discuss this. And then in the last couple weeks, there's been a number of meetings where these packages that sit inside of staging and have external repositories and those things have come up and how we deal with this. In fact, in the SIG CLI, we talked about the premise of an SDK and what it would take to get there. And so I was hoping to figure out or start a conversation on how do we go from where we are to something that is exceedingly consumable for people who want to build tools on top of Kubernetes. And I'm happy to add more context anywhere somebody's got questions on what I mean.
Yeah, so you're not talking about how the current workload controllers are built today. You're talking about how someone building an external tool would depend on ClientGo?
Yeah. And that external tool could be kubectl, it could be Helm, it could be some fun new tool somebody's writing. There are a lot of tools that need a library or an SDK in order to interact with Kubernetes APIs. And they need things like when there's a version upgrade, how the heck do I deal with upgrading from one version to the next? How do I deal with interacting with multiple versions of Kubernetes? There's a lot of ins and outs in solving here, and how do we make that experience better? Because from the sounds of the conversations, it sounds like that's kind of gating some other things happening.
Yeah, let me give the history as I understand it.
Okay.
So we, API Machinery, were blocked in a bunch of stuff until we could sort of publish things differently. Like we needed a separate client so people could vendor that without vendoring the entire world. We needed the API types split out so that people could vendor client and they could vendor the types and they could use some other code without having a big diamond problem. So we sort of did what we had to unblock ourselves. I have a roadmap doc on like how sort of what the next steps would be, but there was enough organizational pushback on continuing to make improvements that I sort of gave up on it for the moment. And it's not blocking anything in SIG API Machinery, so it's not our top priority.
I think there were two parts of that though, right? Or there are two parts of this conversation. One is the repo split and additional repo organization. And the second, to me, is distinct, is the development of a formal SDK as a separate program.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion of an SDK here in the hallways, the pieces that we supply today are not cohesive. It probably is going to take, just like our documentation took like one or two people sitting down and making it make sense. Like it's going to take a few people locking themselves in a room until we get a coherent sort of SDK together, and just nobody's done it.
But it's
Daniel,
specific SIGs, so maybe this is kind of the opportunity for a working group. Matt, are you interested in that kind of arrangement?
Hang on. I first want to make sure we're working on the same problem. So I remember Daniel's doc. Daniel, your doc was about how we could change how we develop Kubernetes to actually develop in separate repos and work that way. But if you are trying, instead of working on Kubernetes, you're trying to develop something separate that is attempting to vendor repos that do already exist. Today, I'm not sure that someone would perceive that much of a difference, right? You have a ClientGo, master is compatible with master, you have particular branches named so that they go together, release 1.8, release 1.7 match together. I can imagine having difficulty making vendoring tools work, but trying to run our development process for Cube internal, I don't think that Matt would see a difference. So just Matt, can you tell us where you got stuck, where you had trouble?
Yeah, that's a fair point, David. Stuff that we need to do for us and stuff that other people need to do to consume it are somewhat different, at least somewhat different problems.
Yeah, and so the consumer experience of things like ClientGo and that, I'm not sure how to put this politely, so please excuse, is considered subpar, and folks are not happy with the experience of consuming it in its current state. I can defer to them in some of that stuff, but it's not consumer friendly at the moment, is how it's perceived.
I think part of that, can you be specific?
Can I be specific?
Yeah.
Sure. Part of this is we'll get into the upgrade experience. That was one of the things we discussed in SIG apps, is when you went for the version that was designed for Kubernetes 1.7, and now you need the version designed for Kubernetes 1.8, actually taking your application and upgrading it to use the new version was really difficult and time consuming. And that's come from a number of different people working on a number of different projects. There isn't a guide on how to do it or what's changed. You got to go figure it out on your own. And it is not intuitive, and there's lots of changes all over the place. And so the experience of upgrading can take people at best days, at worst weeks, in order to upgrade an application, just dealing with this one thing. And so that's a very difficult user experience. And a lot of it has to do with documentation and experience. Then there's the whole point in getting this, right? So for right now, if you want to go get ClientGo, how do you go consume it? I mean, you can go to the repo, but when 1.8 came out, the version 4 of 1.8 wasn't there in the repo, so people would have to pull down all of Kubernetes, then copy from the staging directory into the right place in the vendor directory because we don't have our stuff in sync.
Okay.
And so there's two problems right there, concrete problems.
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. So for the cloning problem, I know that Stefan has been working relentlessly trying to get these pieces working. He and Chao have been trying to get a bot ready to push. I'm not aware of where it's currently stuck, but that is a problem that is actively being worked, and it is one that we should be able to solve, right? It shouldn't take weeks to get updates.
The other problem, the unclear upgrade experience is kind of directly caused by our structure with it being in staging, because the release note generation in the main Kubernetes repo is directed towards releases of Kubernetes. It's not clear which PRs affect the interfaces that ClientGo exports. So
that's part of it.
We have some plans to work on that, and we have some people actually working on it, but I don't know. I think it's going to be really hard to get this right until we ourselves, the Kubernetes engineers, are battling this problem. And the only way we're going to battle this problem is if we switch our development direction.
I think that I have a follow-up question for Matt. Why did you need to update from your 1.7 client to your 1.8 client, right? You should only.
That's definitely a fair question.
So
is it because we didn't have the right types there?
Well, certainly some of the types are new and changing. And so some types, like if you're dealing with RBAC V1 came out in 1.8, and so you need to be able to have access to those types and work with that. Yeah.
So, instead, what if we tried to actually use our semantic versions and do something like ClientGo would be capable of generating code as a version 4.1 that had version 1.8 types? Would that have worked better? Would you then have chosen to upgrade to version 4.1 instead of trying to upgrade to version 5?
That, by the way, is the intention of how ClientGo is supposed to work.
Where the client interfaces stay the same, and all you do is pick up new API types, API type bumps, additional API types.
Yeah, the idea, if you go back to some of our proposal docs around this, is that we were going to actually be versioning the generators that produce ClientGo, and then you can run those generators against whatever source API types you want.
Yeah, I want to make sure that's the problem.
So, but I'm not sure that really helps API consumers, though. I'm sorry, because they're going to want to import a Go package and just use it. Do they want to go start generating files for the bits they need, or
no,
just
we're not talking about them
Okay.
generating. We're talking about running the generators that create the generated clients against the 1.8 API types, the 1.9 API types.
They just run GoDeps again, right?
Yeah, we would be pre-generating these. We have to define some sort of deprecation policy and like generate for a few versions of ClientGo.
Because there's really two dimensions of the way you use ClientGo. There's the Kubernetes APIs that you're talking to over the wire, but then there's the Go APIs that you are using to, construct a client or get an informer or set up a watcher or whatever. And the Kubernetes API types are much slower moving and typically much more additive only. That's not always the case, but that is almost always the case. And so if you were using the same Go APIs to open watches and list things and create and update things, and just the API structs that got sent across the wire to Kubernetes were the things getting changed or picking up a new field or adding a new version, that would be a much smaller change to make consuming that client.
Yeah, and I think that would be a lot easier, especially for folks who have to upgrade, because they say, oh, look, it's just, got the new types that I need to deal with. I'll upgrade to that. I can interact with the new types in the way that I need to. That's a small change for their code, a small conceptual change for them. They don't have to deal with, how do I do this thing differently? Oh, instead of importing API machinery, I just import API. You can start looking at how this works differently. And some of this is because of leaky abstractions, right? Because some of the things you'll get from ClientGo require you to also import API machinery. And so if you could have a nice, concise package that just did the client, and then slowly as new APIs came out, maybe 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and there was less churn on the structure of the code and just brought in the new API types and being able to interact with them, I imagine people would really appreciate that.
Yes. Yeah, so that's something that I think I would try to pursue before I tried to change the Kubernetes development model overall, right? That the problem is that you don't want to get new generated client code that has different APIs. You just want the new types. And I think that's more solvable.
I think there's actually two problems in here that are kind of directly opposed. On the one hand, we, the Kubernetes team, need to add features and make progress and make changes, which are hopefully improvements. On the other hand, users of ClientGo don't want to update their code very often, and like you can't really have both of those things at the same time.
But they do want the new features.
They do want
right. They want new features without any other associated changes.
So it seems like there's consensus and agreement that there is pain to be solved. That was not my initial impression, but it seems like there is a clear understanding that there are improvements to be made. Yeah, I think we made it about a third of the way through your initial doc, which was the worst of the pain on the producer side, but not much consideration on the consumer side. Yeah, is that fair?
I mean, I see every time somebody opens an issue in ClientGo, I get an email. So I'm very well aware of the problems.
Yeah, and just speaking as from the Red Hat OpenShift side, we are equally consumers. So I think we're pretty sympathetic to pain of consumers picking this stuff up.
Also, to be clear, I think Chao put in a lot of effort earlier, but is not right now on this set of issues. Is that also true, Chao?
Right, I don't have time to.
Yeah, so just to be totally open and transparent, that effort, I don't know if Stefan is still working relentlessly on it, but Chao is not right now.
Okay. That's going to be something we need to sync up on, right? Because I know that Stefan was last stuck on some CI pieces, I recall.
Yeah, that's the sync out bit, but that still doesn't solve the structure of what's going on in ClientGo. I mean, should this be the case from what I'm hearing, that we move from what ClientGo is now in the way it is to kind of more the way the other clients are generated, and maybe even generated from the open API documentation plus some other material?
Yeah, we definitely talked about that before, and we just haven't had time to actually pursue it or even. Mehdi, do you have a design? Did you start a design on that?
I didn't.
But we have the generators, so this is feasible to create. So to use the old ClientGo, the old generators with new APIs.
Yeah. So that was the intention, but maybe it'd be easier just to go from open. If people want to publish a specially generated open API source Go client, I have got no problem with that. We just need people to volunteer to
and our tooling completely support that. The generators that we have right now can generate it for Go. The thing is, I think the difference here is, and I don't see that much problem of upgrading in generated clients because we don't have much. There are definitely less features there, but not everybody wants all of those ClientGo features. They may simply want to call some APIs, and they can use a generated version. There is no design out there. Definitely there should be if we want to pursue that. We should compare them. We should see if we want to pursue some generated ClientGo.
May I ask a question? Yeah. So Matt, you said there's a lot of friction when you try to upgrade from 1.7 to 1.8. I want to understand if it's because we split the API out in that release cycle, because the actual API is removed from the ClientGo repo in this release, but we will not have this kind of disruptive change in the future. So I want to understand how much of the problem is caused by that split.
That seems likely.
I mean,
so
we won't have
I
that
actually,
but we will probably have other equally disruptive changes. It's possible.
Every release has brought disruptive changes, and so even 1.6 to 1.7 was disruptive and frustrating. And that was one of the pieces of feedback that came out in the retrospective back then as well. And so it's not just this one time something happened, it's kind of an ongoing thing.
So I went through and I upgraded a program yesterday and today from 4 to 5, and there were 3 things that I ran into. One was the moving of the APIs out of ClientGo and into K.O/API. That was an easy fix. Another one were some changes that Clayton did for the speedy remote command execution, also an easy fix. And then the third one, I happened to be I was creating a dynamic client and expecting it to return a pointer to a struct, and it's now returning an interface, also an easy fix. I think there's probably 2 things that would be helpful. One we already talked about, which is making it possible for you just to get the new API types without having to change the major version on your client. And the second one would be having excellent documentation around what are the breaking changes between v4, v5, v6, and so on.
Howie and I actually wrote a changelog. I don't know if we actually cover all those breaking changes in the changelog.
Yeah, the changelog is manually generated. It misses things. Yeah, and this is because we don't have an automated system that separates out things that affect ClientGo from things that affect the rest of the main repository.
And that's something, and this is one of those things about it being built as part of the main repository. It's part of building Kubernetes rather than coming at it from the perspective of, I'm a consumer. And so, I mean, that's even one of the benefits for doing something, even if it's more than just the generated code, in a separate repo from the standpoint of a consumer, which is what a client really is.
Yeah, I mean, it is the way it is because this is the most direct route to publishing a Go client. Just to publish the one that we ourselves are using. Okay, I don't know what concrete action items we can get out of this because it's kind of a large problem. I know if people are interested in starting a working group, that Whitrock has worked a little bit on various related things. If we're interested in making an SDK, like you might want to.
Stefan, are you still stuck on the cloning bit, on the pushing changes out?
Yeah, there's a big question where the bot should run, that people outside of Google can access it. There was discussion in SIG testing about that. Maybe some CNCF cluster, that's what I heard. That's one, that's one bit which is blocked at the moment.
So I didn't realize that Chao wasn't working on this anymore. Do we need someone on the Google side to
Chao is not the one that would need. Chao is not the one that would need to answer those questions anyway. Maybe we can take an action item to go talk to our Intrapod team and get some more eyes on it.
I missed the last part of that about something outside of Google can access it. Is this?
I can catch you up to speed after
build. Is this the same bucket as the release, patch release and branch release manager?
It is
related.
Yeah,
it's also about
really
resources.
Yeah. Stefan's been trying to work blindfolded to fix this problem, basically. He can't see what's running. He doesn't have direct access to it.
I remember vaguely. Yes, I will follow up on this one.
Yeah, so I talked to Chao about that, and we agreed we need at least 3 people who really know this bot and also code behind the publishing algorithm to really make it reliable.
Okay, on the larger question though, I still feel like there are API machinery interests, there are SIG CLI interests, there are also touches on Contribex, and the biggest problem in this project, in my last 6 months observation, is that there's no real ownership, and so it sort of is someone call 911 instead of you specifically call 911 and come back here. And so that's why I suggest the working group path. Otherwise, it seems to fall through the cracks release after release. I am not volunteering to lead that working group.
I was just about to ask.
But that seems like the most likely next step, Matt. If your goal was to articulate the pain, I think that is accomplished. If the goal is to make progress, I think there needs to be some additional step like that.
Okay, yeah, so this came up in SIG CLI. I'll feed this conversation back. Somebody over there actually said maybe it's time for SIG SDK. I don't know the right answer, and I'm not signing up to lead something, but I'm also willing to take this back to SIG Apps because there are a number of people over there who are really interested in this and see what comes of that. I do see, maybe this is people from a few different SIGs have vested interest, working group, whatever we do to organize around it, I think it would be worthwhile. And so I can fire this off to SIG CLI again and then take it back to SIG Apps in the next meeting on Monday and see if there's any interest there too.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for coordinating.
And if anybody interested in pursuing the client-generated ClientGo from OpenAPI, I would definitely be happy to help there.
Yeah, if you've got a pointer to where somebody who's interested in that could get started learning more about what we're doing and how it works and how to get involved.
I can definitely do that. I can definitely add some pointers there. I'll add some pointers. But the whole question of SDKs can come of it for other languages too. So it could be interesting to look at that as a generated OpenAPI client because that would be scalable to other languages too. I'm not suggesting we should do that. I'm just saying we should look at the option.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, and last, I just thought I'd mention, I think we've made pretty good progress on the design phase of getting webhooks to beta. I think we're going to distribute the last few design docs immediately if we haven't already, and I don't expect the rest of it to be controversial. So, yeah.
And Daniel, I think you said you're working on getting it into contribute.
Yeah, I'm going to work on taking the big design doc and putting it into the community repo.
Can we take what we had back on October 11th and move that, and then that way any changes we'll see as a diff to the community repo? I think that would help a lot. I can put that if we need to.
It should be easy to do with Google Docs revisions, export a copy, export that to Markdown.
Yeah, I can try to do it that way because I have made some changes and tweaks, and yeah, we can try and do it that way.
Yeah, because I noticed there have been some significant changes to the doc further on. There were some questions I think that have been answered, but I think we agreed to a snapshot in time, and then if we're going to change it from that snapshot in time, I'd like to see those change bars.
Yeah, I think the stuff I've in has all been making it more concrete, and so I don't expect much controversy, but yeah, we can do it that way.
And relatedly, I've got some open polls you're going to circle back.
Yeah, I reviewed one of them yesterday, and I hope to get to the other today.
Great. Great. I have responses, and I hadn't seen responses to responses yet.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't even made it through my email this morning yet. So, all right. I don't think there's anything else.
One more reminder: feature freeze is day after tomorrow. Yeah. Don't forget, if you plan to do something, make sure that gets in.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you again in 2 weeks.